Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with Paul Rossi. I became aware of Paul when I read in Barry Weiss's Substack. He'd written article slash letter, I guess, directed at his school about some of the stuff that was going on. Call it CRT, call it diversity training or culturally sensitive training. Um, and then there was some fallout from that. So I thought I'd get him to come on and talk a bit about that and a bit about what's going on in education. Hey Paul, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, babe.
So yeah, as I mentioned, I read that article in Barry Weiss's, or I read, you know, the Substack Barry Weiss did, and so you'd written that article slash letter. So if you wouldn't mind
Hmm.
starting with that, and we can go from there.
Sure. I started the article came out in April,
Mhm.
mid-April, but I kind of started to get in serious touch with the school around late February because of my participation in a racially segregated Zoom meeting for white faculty and uh, students only. And in this meeting, which was supposed to be a meeting about self care during the pandemic, up came the slide by the facilitator, very well known slide, but at this point, about white supremacy culture, claiming that individualism and objectivity and a right to comfort were characteristics of white supremacy. When I questioned some of those things publicly in the meeting in front of 200 students and about 50 of my colleagues, I, I was I became a scapegoat basically for the administration, even though many of the students and faculty shared my questions and were as vocal as I was in raising concerns about the content of the segregated meeting. And then because of that, I was put through um, a little bit of a series of punitive things by the administration where they were trying to recover their, their um, sort of recover their branding as an anti-racist institution and distance themselves from me. And as a result of some of those things, I wrote my letter about what I'd experienced at the school for the past few years.
Okay, great. I should say great, but that's one of the things, like the anti-racist credentials of the school. But segregation in the name of anti-racism does not sound like what I would think anti-racism is.
Yeah, you wouldn't, would you? I mean, I certainly wouldn't. But there is a very very convoluted justifications for these things based in the theoretical premises. Um, and I find it fascinating. Uh, the justifications for it, even though they're I find them debilitating for the people who are forced to undergo them, like the students and my colleagues as well.
Now, if I remember correctly, you were at a private school, and I started following this a while ago, and I only really started following the education stuff probably around 2018.
Hmm.
Because I was just more as because you know I was getting called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam. I was like, where the hell is that coming from?
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Like, a, I'm not white, so that.
Hmm.
But so like, I mean, I'd read about the Fieldstone Academy. I'd read about Dalton School and stuff that had happened there. So I'm just curious, like when you see what happened at the Fieldstone Academy when they started segregating their kids, 45 minutes a week and telling them to appreciate their race, except for the white kids, or they're telling them, okay, you're all oppressors and stuff like that. Like, doesn't wouldn't administrators say, okay, this experiment's being run. Like, why are they? Is this like the whole thing of real communism hasn't been tried type of thing, or do they all think they can do it better than the others, or like what's the impetus for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way they look at it, it is sort of a Puritan mindset. The idea is that the world is hopelessly corrupted by racism,
Mm.
and that when you couple that with the blank slate kind of idea of human nature, you wind up with what's a sort of de facto essentialism, where we can't avoid our racial coding or our gender coding or our, whatever our socially imposed identities are. So to ignore those things or to try to reach for some common humanity is to evade the conditions in which we're all born into. So the idea is that by forming affinity groups, they could be optional or mandatory. The meetings that I was in were mandatory. But the idea is that you gain a race, you admit and sort of come to see your racial programming, um, whether whether it's as an oppressor or as a marginalized or subaltern or however you want to, I see these different groups, and then only when you have that understanding of your racialized identity can you proceed to break down and dismantle these structures by, or celebrate and use them as a mode of empowerment. If you're in the marginalized group.
Yeah, I mean, like I look at that, and the underlying oppression, the underlying, like, basically, like, that's the, from what I read, that's from critical theory, where you look at the, you break down you take away the veil of the world and you see all the oppression. And I mean, okay, I'm not a religious person, an atheist, um, but I equated that to Ezekiel. I'm like, okay, well,
Mm,
Ezekiel pulled away the veil and he saw paradise. These guys pull away the veil and all they see is oppression and awfulness. And it's
mm,
just, it's such a weird way of looking at things. I mean, if you read
mm,
James Baldwin, or if you listen to, or you read the speeches from Martin Luther King, or anything like that, or read Toni Morrison, it's, yeah, they can talk about awful things, but there's a message of hope in there. But this, it
mhm,
just seems like you're not giving kids any hope. You're not giving, like, this is your lot in
mhm,
life and this is what you're stuck with.
mhm.
And I mean, how is, okay, we can get into the whole education thing, like how, like, not a lot of kids can read and write and all that right now, but like, how is that supposed to help kids grow up into be functioning adults?
Well, it's not. That's not the point. The point is not to help the kid become a functioning adult. The point is to effect revolution. So revolution is the collective liberation is the mode by which an individual can attain essentially like spiritual health or well-being. It's a completely collectivist mindset that we had at our school. That is, we group identity, collective identity, these were the things that would save us, not and whether or not an individual can go on to have a happy productive life was, it would have been an outcome of their, successful, political activism or or coming to consciousness. And I think that's what I found really crazy, frankly, and against the mission of what education is supposed to be.
You know, sort of on this, like, I always say, like, I've got a lot of problems with, call it whatever you want, critical race theory when it comes to race, or the gender theory stuff. Um, but my biggest issue with all these things is it talks about the secondary issues. Like, if you're talking about education, again, like I said, I just started looking at the stats and stuff, and when only 35% of the kids can read proficiently, or
Hmm.
only, I think it was 22% of the kids can do math proficiently.
Hmm.
Like, that should be your biggest goal, not, you know, not dividing kids into affinity groups, not talking about disrupting and dismantling the systems of oppression. Again, if it's a parent looking at this, because I know a lot of parents all of a sudden since last year have been really paying a lot of attention to this. Like, how do school boards justify that? Like I said, I believe you're in a private school, but, like, how do, if you're asking people to pay, like, I think Fieldstone Academy and or Dalton, they were like 45,000 a year or something like that. Like, how can you
Yeah, they're
justify
all in
that?
the range of like 40,000, 50,000. Some of them get up to 57,000.
Yeah.
It's culturally responsive education. So the way that, with very, I think, dubious research behind it, the idea is that the reason why um, minority schools with minority populations are doing so poorly is a result of, say, too many white teachers, or it's a move to culturally responsive education where, if we only made people feel welcome and comfortable, or if we only communicated these things in such a way that these students could, quote unquote, see themselves represented properly in the material or in the teacher, then outcomes would be different. And I just find absolutely very spurious evidence for that. But it's extremely helpful if you are, um, for various reasons, trying to hide the ball for incompetence in these schools, in these public schools, or if you're a member of a teachers union for displacing the responsibility for, you know, incompetence. So there are a lot of stakeholders that benefit from framing the issue in this way. I see it as sort of, that kind of problem coupled, as a major current, as well as ideological true believer commitments that are being made. I think some of it is just functionally, it defends the major players from having to accept responsibility for what's going on.
Okay, so kind of passing the buck. Now,
Yeah.
getting back to you, like you were a math teacher. Now, I'm
Mm-hmm.
assuming that you weren't the only one at that school, but wasn't anyone else concerned about this? Wasn't anyone else saying, "Well, this is not going to work"? But like you spoke up, then you were, I guess you were fired. Um, like, is that just to quell dissent in the school? Like, okay, we've made an example of this guy. If you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. Or, if all, let's say the whole math department en masse came up and said, this is wrong. Like, I mean, what are they going to do? Fire all of you? Or like, I mean, it's,
Well, I think that it was the public way that I did it, and I meant
yeah,
to do it publicly. I think
yeah,
that there are many of my colleagues have approached me with concerns about some of the excesses of these things, even though they're very left liberal. Some of them had problems with some of the identity politics, and they would say things like, "Oh, I wouldn't go as far as you, Paul, but I this is weird, or this is kind of wrong, or but what moved me to do what I did was because I had students approach me, and I knew that there were students who felt that they couldn't question this material when it was being brought up as utterly factual, like it is the foundation of reality, and they felt that they couldn't question it without running afoul of their friends or the social pressures, or even in some cases having academic consequences for questioning it. And I was pleased that when I did that, it did sort of break the ice, as one student later told me. I have the transcript from the chat, and in that transcript, not only students were saying things like, "Oh, I don't think I'm ignorant just because I'm white," and I don't feel comfortable with splitting up meetings by race, and even some teachers came in and defended some of the content of what I was saying. So even though they tried to make it look like it was just one teacher, myself namely, it was clear from anyone in that meeting that it wasn't just me. And that was, I think, what was so concerning to them, that they felt, I mean, they could feel the ideology kind of crumbling beneath them. So in their public statement to the school community, they had to make this long reaffirmation of their commitment to anti-racism. And the project of the school is to quote unquote undo racism. Um,
yeah, that's a big ask.
so yeah, and I don't see how strengthening everybody's socially imposed racial identities is going to get us there. I don't see how that works, but um, what it does do though is it allows the time horizon to stretch infinitely, and to allow for a sort of diversity industrial complex to intermediate and charge the school large sums of money and create positions within the school to manage it. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, the money aspect. A couple of years ago, I spoke with a teacher out of Texas, and she'd started up a thing called Donors Choose, and there was a hashtag going around, clear the lists. And it was just, I mean, whenever I could, I'd spend a couple $100 here and there buying stuff off teachers' lists. Like they would make Amazon lists, and people would buy stuff for them. And some of the things I saw were like pencil sharpeners. And I'm thinking to
Mm-hmm.
myself, okay, you're in the United States, quote unquote, the richest country in the world, and you can't put pencil sharpeners in the classroom, but you're spending 20 grand on Ibram Kendi. Like there is a problem of priorities of where you're spending the money there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's tremendous anxiety um, among educators to get on board with this, and administrators and school boards, that they need to signal that that they are good people. And I think that's what's driving so much of this is the moral vacuum, that people need something to establish that they're on the right side of history, uh, which is, a very particular kind of moral righteousness. But people, especially educators, they tend to be good people. So I think they're even more susceptible to these kind of many messianic, um, visions of how to be good. And so I think that's part of it
Yeah,
too.
that's. I mean, when you mentioned people want to do the right thing, it's like a couple of years back I read the book Kindly Inquisitors, the Jonathan Rick book, and
Mm,
you know, I mean, he was talking about stuff in the '90s, but when he called it the humanitarian threat to liberal science, I mean, that's exactly what it is. You're playing on people's good intentions. You're warping that around, and it's like, don't you want to be a good person? Don't you want to do that? And I mean, you're basically making people do awful things in the name of goodness. I mean, one of the things, okay, when I first came back from overseas, I saw all this stuff going on, and there was this Milton quote from Paradise Lost that kept going through my head, and it was like, a batch the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is, and I'm like, you people have turned goodness awful, and that's
mm,
exactly what they're
mm,
doing. Like it's, and I was like, okay, you're going to have an overcorrection. I thought maybe Trump was the overcorrection. I thought maybe Charlottesville was the overcorrection that would people would snap out of it. But I mean, I'm reading stuff in the APA where the like white children are growing like there's a larger percentage of white children growing a white identity, and
Oh
that it
yeah,
all.
yeah.
I mean,
And
I'm like,
that's I should say that's not a bug, that's a feature. Like they want the people pushing this, the more division they create, the more it validates their view of the world. So if you are a CRT apologist, or you someone that believes in that, if you create more white supremacy, you can simply say, well, see, look, I told you. Now it's just overt. It was covert before, now it's overt. So that's none of the things that can come out of this backlash, like you're mentioning, which I agree with you, is going to be disconfirming to anyone who is on board with it, um, which is extremely scary and dangerous. And that really, really worries me. Um,
are you worried about a backlash from parents? Like, I know there's a lot been going on the last year about school choice, which I think, like, I'll give you an example for myself. I went to 8 different schools between kindergarten and grade 6, and that a couple of times
wow.
was because we moved, but most of it was because my mom was like, "Oh, you know what? I heard this school's better. I heard that school's better." So I just kept going to a different school.
Hmm.
Um, but she had that choice, and these were all public schools. None of them were private, you know. But she had that choice. So now when you're seeing this push for school choice, I mean, a lot of people are saying, "Well, that's an attack on public schools. You're going to destroy the public school system." But if a charter school fails and it's not doing it, they fail. They go out of business. If a private school doesn't do what they're supposed to do, they go out of business. So you know, I don't want to see public school system collapse. I shore it up, make it better, because yeah, there are neighborhoods that need it. There are communities that need a public school. But are you afraid of something like that, where there's so much backlash from parents that it's like, okay, we're just going to give up on the whole enterprise?
I think about that too, and I don't know what's right and wrong. I do know, however, that public schools are a complete failure. I mean,
Mm,
as far as most of them in major urban centers, and that there are families that are trapped in a situation where they have a monopoly. They have to participate in this government monopoly, and it is not working for them. It is not working for those kids. And I think that the statistics on communities, they would love to have some kind of school choice. In New York City, charter schools, as I understand it, are just a non-starter. New charter schools, there are some, but um, I I think the competition would actually help public schools. I mean, I'm not an expert on this
mhm.
issue, but I think having viable alternatives is going to make public schools have to earn their students back and rebuild the public trust, because right now it's just broken in so many communities, and that need it desperately. And there are other issues that we could talk about that I am not well versed on. Things like the property tax
Yeah.
as a way of funding schools. I think that should be addressed because it's not fair, and I would like to see that addressed somehow. But these are complicated, complex issues. But I think school choice is an important part of that.
Now I know you're a teacher, and I don't want to ask you things that you probably don't know. So if I ask you something and you're not sure,
Okay,
but just let me know. But like I'd
sure.
read Thomas Sowell's latest book, Charter Schools and their
I read that
enemies,
one too. Yeah.
and then I spoke with Ian Rowe, and he talked about this. Sowell was talking about the same building serving the same neighborhood. Half of it's a district school, the other half's a charter school, and the kids in the charter school are getting some of the best results in the country, whereas the district school is getting some of the worst. So now when you're the mayor of New York City or whatever, mayor of a city, or school superintendent or anything like that, would you have that kind of data in front of you? Like, how do you ignore that?
Well, you ignore that because who's funding your campaign?
Yeah,
I mean, it's just like, did you see On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando?
yeah,
Okay, so what happens if someone wants to unload at another dock and the guys aren't getting paid? Someone's going to get their legs broken. Okay, we don't have that anymore. But you do have immense leverage from organizations that function um, above, what counts as above board these days, but it's just causes intense pressure when you have union funded campaigns
yeah. I
and
mean,
lobbying organizations. I mean, there's just so much. You don't have the ability as a politician who gets elected by the ground game run. Also there's the ground game in these elections. Like, you just have it. There are just so many forces working against going by the data that it's sad. But I think that's the reality.
okay. I mean, the media is another issue, but like, okay, like everyone talks about the NRA funding, the GOP and all that, but there's not a lot of talk about teachers unions funding the Democrats. And I mean, is that by design, do you think, or is that just like it's easier to focus on the NRA because guns are evil?
Well, I think the media leans left. They're going to talk about, they're going to make the boogeyman, those relationships on the right. I think there's their fingers on the scale. I think it's part of it. Um, I wish it got more attention, frankly, but I think
Do you think after this year you might start seeing some change? Because I mean, okay, again, I'm focusing on it, so I'm kind of seeing a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot of parents, like, frankly, just pissed off, and
yeah,
rightfully so. So, do you think politicians might change a little bit now, or is it the money's just too nice?
no, I think politicians. I mean, the good news is I'm getting lots of emails from parents and teachers that supported my article that are saying things like, "Oh, I didn't even know this was an issue before the pandemic," or I was just trying to get my kids back into the school, and the unions were the teachers unions were saying, only if it's completely safe will we go in and do our jobs. So the unions lost a lot of, I guess I would say, um, credibility from parents and voters by really protecting themselves over to a degree that was excessive over doing their jobs. At least that is really how it's perceived, and that hurt their credibility. And then on top of that, um, the I guess the AFT and the ANEA coming out in favor of CRT is going to have an impact on that. So I think they don't have that long of a leash anymore.
Well, I just saw like a couple of things. The NEA scrubbed some stuff from 2019 that showed that they were failing, reading and writing and all that. They just scrubbed it straight off their website, and it's, if I'm a parent, I see that, I'm going to get, quite pissed. But just like part of the, okay, I don't want to blame, like I said, this is, it's not a single silver bullet here. Like I know there's a lot of moving parts, but once the pandemic happened and parents started seeing what was going on in the classroom, like maybe they weren't paying attention before for all kinds of reasons, like single parents, um, like a couple of states have started putting in those, like, so, quote unquote free range kids laws where, if you let your 10-year-old or 11-year-old go down the road to the park, you're not going to have, child protective services knock on your door type of thing, right? Like, do you think things like that would help where parents have to be interested in what's going on with their kids? And I'm not saying parents aren't, but they also have to have the time to be able to look over the kids' schoolwork, because the curriculum could say, okay, we're going to do culturally responsive, education. And that sounds nice and it sounds great. Okay, this, but until you get into the nuts and bolts of what's actually being taught in that classroom, you don't know. So, like, do you think there's going to be more of a push for things like that, or do you like? Would you like to see some things like that change, whereas parents have a little bit more time to look at stuff?
Oh, I love it. I mean, parents, that's, they're incredibly busy and overtaxed, and with everything that's happening, it's
Mm.
very hard to keep your eyes on things. And one thing I would love to do, I'm working with a couple of people on this right now, and a teacher network, establishing a teacher network, and also with parents where we can, create a map that actually crosses over all the existing organizations where you can see curriculum in your district. Um, and we hope to be able to execute FOIA requests on curriculum and also collect from volunteers, so that no matter what county you live in, you can
Mm.
see what's children are learning without being rifling through your child's backpack, or having to go to great lengths to obtain it. And then connecting people who have concerns about those things in an anonymous way.
I just want to
Um,
get back because you mentioned working with a couple of people, but I just want to get back to that in a second. But that what's going on in the classrooms, like I think it was North Carolina that passed legislation or has it proposed where it has to be transparency in the curriculum. But I think, and they said, okay, you have to show the year, like the previous year's lessons plans. So it's not just, okay, we're gonna read Huck Finn, or we're gonna read Cry the Beloved Country, or whatever. It's how you're going to teach that. Like I was speaking to someone yesterday, and I use this as an example. I said, okay, you can take Huck Finn and you can teach it, you know, the way I kind of learned it, where it was, okay, Huck realizing that this was all wrong, and he hears Jim crying about his family, and lets Jim go at he realizes that there's a common humanity there. Jim's crying about his family the same way Huck would miss his family, and like all that, realizes
mhm.
this is wrong. Or you could be a quote unquote woke teacher and say, well, that's Jim just you know using sorry, that's Huck using Jim's emotional labor and exploiting that and being a white savior. I mean, you can take that book and teach it in two different ways and get a completely different message.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I mean that's completely missing the point.
Yeah.
And yeah, and really, it's just so self-serving.
Yeah.
Um, that what winds up happening is that the ideology winds up becoming more important than what's healthy for people. So yeah, God, exactly. So you need to know exactly how it's being taught, and what is the lesson plan.
Yeah, I know some people are saying I'll put cameras in the classroom, but like, okay, I'm not for cameras in the classroom. I don't think, because I don't know if you could teach properly. Even if you're all good intention, you want to do well, but then you're kind of second guessing yourself at every moment because, okay,
Mhm.
what if I say something wrong or
That would
whatever?
be hard. I mean, I would
Yeah.
I would find that very hard as a teacher to have a camera in the classroom. It would really be stifling to personality, being an engaging teacher,
Mhm.
because you do need to have some leeway where you can't be thinking about what the least common denominator if someone's going to object to you every second. Um, but I think in some ways these laws are kind of missing the point, because I mean it is important, and I think I do defend the making of laws
Mhm.
as a small d democratic means to restore what parents want their kids to be learning, especially if we're talking about K through 12 and particularly K through 8. But I know I have colleagues that teach CRT, and unapologetically so, and they are committed to collective liberation of what is now called the global majority. And so to them, and some of them are very talented, and they will A, not be deterred by this, and B, they will find a way to teach things under the radar. For example, if someone recently on Twitter pointed out the book Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks, and that's part of her trilogy of books on how, pedagogical toolkit and a narrative. By telling a great story, a teacher can avoid running afoul of the laws and still make the point. So using narrative in really clever, creative ways is something that a master teacher can do, because in the classroom, the teacher is, they're in charge and they can run the class any way they want, essentially. So they can get around these things. And many of these teachers are very charismatic. And so I've been looking into some of the DEI consultancies and how some of the best ones, and when I say the best ones, I mean the most artful, are pushing back on the parents that are pushing back and the kinds of narratives that they're telling now. And it really is, these are some phenomenally skilled educators. And it is remarkable to see them able to tell a story that communicates things like white comfort or silence equals violence without actually, in a ham-handed fashion, putting up a slide that says, white comfort or they don't have to spell it out. They can just tell a story that leaves the student with that impression and gives them a moral to the story that is clear. So I find, I'm not sure how much purchase these laws are going to actually have. On the flip side, I think they might actually have a chilling effect on open discussion. I think that is a problem, especially at the high school level. I do think that we need to have sort of free-flowing discussions, and a teacher can be accused of running afoul of the law simply by tacitly maybe nodding or not objecting when a student says something about, all Black people are oppressed or all white people are oppressors or something like that. Like, they can be impugned simply for letting it happen or maybe giving a sign that it's okay. I think that teachers will be worried about that. So it could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, like the laws, like I agree with you there. I think they're, except for the one in Idaho, and I don't want to say I've read them all because there's a lot of them, but out of the ones I've read, I think the one in Idaho was the best because all it just did was reaffirm the Civil Rights Act, and it even mentions a couple of state legislations that are civil rights. It doesn't talk about how kids should feel or anything like that, because I think putting in the talk of feeling and all that's just way too much. Like, just leave that out, but just say you cannot teach anything. Like, I basically, it says you can't hold people responsible for the sins of the past. Like, like it's the sins of the father aren't going to pass on to the son, right? Like, like you don't do that. Which I think if you had and again, I looked at it from the way of, okay, like, we've lost all trust. Like, I mean, I don't trust anything anymore especially after this last year, like, and so if you give that, it might just give parents a little bit of a warm fuzzy. Okay, we've got something we can trust. And it's just, like I said, if you reaffirm those laws without getting into like the feeling thing, I think then that's a decent legislation. It gives, I mean, there's still going to have to be litigation if it has to go that route. There's still going to have to be, other kind of things, but it's just another layer of support type of thing.
And I think it is necessary because, the existing laws, the way that the bar is so high to actually pursue a claim and to have it picked up by, DOJ or, the federal in this situation. I think there needs to be some reinforcing at the state level so that parents have another option that's easier to prosecute.
Yeah, or like maybe, I don't know, an ombudsman board or something like that that's kind of independent that you can go to. That's, it's because, I mean, frankly, if I was a parent and my kid came home and said that, well, I'm oppressed because I'm brown, or like you hear the things like, white adjacent, like Asians are white adjacent. I'm like, like,
Yeah.
what the hell is that?
Well, there's this thing that really is so fascinating to me is the proliferation of the idea of whiteness and blackness. Like, at this point, with these concepts, we've racialized culture now to the extent where, race subsumes and substitutes for culture. So you have this floating signifier that can be latched onto any emotion or concept whatsoever. So you have, white comfort.
Mm.
The black students demanding change at my school talked about white opinions, and how, we shouldn't have to listen to white opinions. And I was like, what is a white opinion? You can stick whiteness is now, you have black joy. Blackness is a quality which can float between any person or race, or, and even though it's, but what's interesting is, like, there's segregation in those things. So a black person exhibiting whiteness is not good, and a white person exhibiting blackness is not good. So there's this segregation that's going on. um, and I just think it's so awful. um, and it's also just this immediate justification for anything. You can talk about internalized white
Yeah.
supremacy. Multiracial whiteness is simply just an explanation for anyone who disagrees with you. You can wash your hands of it. You don't have to think about it. It just maintains the ideology. And that is the thing that scares me the most, is that these concepts can just be applied willy-nilly to things that, and also it encourages a performative aspect, right? So it's not enough to be brown or black. If you are racially coded that way, you have to exhibit blackness. You have to engage, as part of your journey to consciousness, you have to you're encouraged to manifest your blackness in a particular way, like they did at my school.
Uh,
And I think kids are getting pushed into these archetypes without, for the benefit of the administration and the teachers, because they get to feel like, oh, we're helping them be authentic, we're helping these kids be themselves, when in fact they're pushing them to be a particular way. Or if you're white, then you can't avoid your racial coding, and you have to acknowledge it and then take responsibility and your complicity and all this other stuff. So it's on both sides of the equation. It's
yeah.
really bad.
But I mean, it's also hypocritical because I mean, if you take the whole and like this is some of the stuff that I would agree with when it comes to things like CRT. Okay, so yes, the whole concept of race started in Europe, and but they were classifying things, and
Mm-hmm.
they put these racial identities on people. But now, if someone says I'm acting white, I'm like, you're doing the same thing. Like you're putting a racial identity on me, and you're leaving me no choice. I mean, just being completely hypocritical in the way you talk.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to get back, like you'd mentioned, you've been working with a couple of people. So, like the organizations that you're seeing popping up, like, do you, like, I know, do you hope that they're more localized, or would you rather them be like national organizations?
Both. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the local focused ones are the ground game, and the national ones you think of as the air game. So it's, and so you absolutely need, what we're seeing go viral. Parents at school board meetings, which is fantastic. Um, you need that. I mean, I think, Parents Defending Ed is doing great work, and other organizations are great. But then some of the other organization, FAIR is building a national network. They seem to be doing almost everything, or trying to do, things all over the place, which is good. Um, I think there is a bit of a vertical, sometimes a disconnect between the intellectuals up here in the press, but then you have like the parents on the ground. And I think the parents on the ground really need more support from these national organizations, these large organizations. And I worry that they're not getting the resources they need to actually do the work on the ground, and advocating for themselves. I think, like any movement, there are organizations that are building their war chests for, political action or whatever. But I think that I worry that the ordinary Joe and Janes are going to not get what they need. That's my concern. Sort of like, Camille Foster makes this point about the Tea Party. Like, what is the Tea Party? What's the lasting legacy of the Tea Party? Some people got into office, some organizations got some money. I don't think this is the same. I worry that it could be the same, but I don't think it is yet. I want to encourage everyone I speak to actually get the money to the people that need it.
Keep kind of sticking with this because I mean, like I said, I'd spoken to someone yesterday. It was a gentleman by the name of Jason Littlefield who's doing like a new version of SEL.
Oh yeah,
And
I know Jason.
yeah, and I said, okay, like anything you do right now is just a stopgap. If you don't fix the colleges of education, if you don't fix, the academy, or 10 years down the road, you're just going to have far more teachers who think this way than you do now. So, I mean, even if you're like, okay, we're going to homeschool or we're going to build a little pod school for our street and everyone on, but where are you going to get the teachers? If the teachers aren't trained to teach in a classical liberal sense, as opposed to like, the social justice sense, who's going to fill those shoes? Like, I mean, like I
Yeah,
said, it's a lot of moving parts here.
yeah. I mean, and it, to some degree, you might say, well, if we can change the K through 12 through laws, legislation, and
Mm,
curriculum alternatives, well, then they won't be able to teach that. They won't have jobs to do
mm,
what they want to do. But at the same time, you're right. You have to eventually get into these education degree programs. I mean, was it? Uh, I think I saw it was James Lindsay
mm,
or maybe yourself that were talking about Henry Giroux and basically bragging that he and Paulo Freire got 100 tenured positions in education schools through their publishing network.
yeah,
So like, and now it's just metastasized to that degree. So now it's I don't know, what are the statistics, like 95% liberal, 98% liberal,
yeah.
left liberal, woke liberal. So you're right. You're right. I agree.
Like on this, you're seeing all these parents go out and speaking up, and there's videos of them and stuff. Like if I was a parent, I'd be insanely pissed off at like college professors, especially
Mm.
ones with tenure. Here are parents who are they're taking a risk. Their employer might say, "Oh, you're racist. We're going to fire you. You're going to do this or whatever." If their kids are at a private school, kick their kids out, or anything like that. Like, or the kids get bullied. Whereas you have these professors who are not speaking up. Like I see, like like professors who are vocal. They're like, oh, I get hundreds of messages. Like John McWhorter talked about, he wrote that Atlantic article, and he keeps talking about, oh, getting all kinds of things from academics who are afraid to speak out, especially if you're in university. Isn't that your job? Isn't that your job to discuss dangerous ideas and have an open debate? But like it's just average parents just going up and just putting themselves on the line now.
When you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose.
Yeah,
Janice Joplin, right? Or maybe she's quoting someone else.
yeah,
But when you have something, you got something to lose. So what I've noticed is the it's counterintuitive. The more well heeled you are, the more you have to protect. The less you're going to put your neck on the block. So yeah, I mean that's why someone like Gabby Clark can pursue legislation and that's why I think I've given up on the idea that academics are gonna put their reputations at risk. I know. I mean, I
yeah.
know. I mean,
But I
it,
mean, it's
it,
like,
it's human nature, though. I mean, I really
yeah,
think it's human nature. It's like, oh, the humanity, the venality of the human who can't, take
yeah,
the risk. And I don't even blame because it just is.
yeah. Okay,
I know.
so I went to school. So Quebec's got a slightly different education system than the rest of North America because we always have to be different. So high school goes up to grade 11. Then you have a 2-year thing called CEGEP, which is kind of like a junior college. And then it's 3 years to get your bachelor's. So it works out to the same number of years, just broken up differently. I was always interested in science. I got really good grades in science, did well. So I got into CEGEP. And I mean, I literally had a chemistry professor tell me, if you don't do it the way I show you, like we were doing redox equation. So you like, you break the equation down and all that. And the way, like I took an AP class in high school, the way my teacher taught me, it really made sense to me. And I did it that way. I showed all my work, all that. the professor at CJEP was doing it slightly different way, and it just didn't make sense. So I just started doing it the way I was taught, and just showing all my work, going through all the steps, and getting the right answer. And he told me straight out, like, if you don't do it the way I show you, I'm going to fail you. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not what I was taught science was. Like, it's not
Mhm.
a body of knowledge or anything like that. It's you look at it, you argue, and you look at different ways of. So that really got me disinterested in science, and then I always had a love of history and philosophy and stuff. So I went to poli sci. I just said, screw the sciences. Like, I'm just going to go into political science.
Oh, that's too bad. Yeah, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but no, but I mean, when I started getting to things like that, no, he wasn't the only one. Like, I had a biology professor tell me something similar. I had a physics teacher tell me something, and it was just like, this is not what science was meant to be, and it just disheartened me. So, like, I just don't like. I can see why parents would get frustrated. I can see, like, but like, to see that coming from the academy, like, see the cowardice of these people, like these institutions that are supposed to, open debate and debating dangerous ideas and debating difficult ideas. They're just kind of cowering, and like, you reward the people with tenure who have shut up for, like, whatever, 5 or 6 years, and then you give them.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to need new institutions, and I think that the new institutions, if they're successful, and then they're going to put pressure on the existing ones, and then all of this higher education may be in a bubble, and the internet may disintermediate all of it. So I think this may just be, like, what's the Bugs Bunny cartoon where Daffy Duck is in the clam at the end and he's holding onto the pearl. Like, he's like, I'm rich, I'm a happy miser. It's closing on him. I think that's what's maybe happening to some of these higher education institutions, and
I
an
heard about one.
enormous bloat
Yeah.
that they're.
Yeah, I mean, that's just one thing too. Like, they talk about get rid of student loans and this and that. I'm like, okay, well, stop hiring diversity officers at a couple $100,000 a year. Stop doing all that. Like, whatever. What Yale's got, what, $40 billion trust, endowment. Like, use some of that money. Like, like, don't
Mhm.
I could. But yeah, there was one university I heard about recently. Like, it was an online thing, and they were going to be a classical liberal university. It starts with an R. I'm trying to remember what the name of it is, like Ralston or something like
Oh
that.
yes, yeah, I heard of them. I don't know the
Yeah,
name, but yeah, I think that might have been it.
yeah. Like, yeah, something like that. Like, if these people had, if you had a viable option, I think parents would take it.
Yeah, in New York, there is so much buzz about of many different people who approach me saying, "Oh, we should start a different school. We should start a different school, private school." If the funding came through, you would get people lined up around the block. You'd get teachers wanting to teach there.
Mm.
I think it would be controversial, and you
Mm.
would have lots of stories in the press about the anti-woke school where, you know. But I think if they just hold the line and tough it out, um, I think it could. I think it would succeed.
Um, like, we talking a little bit earlier, and you'd mentioned that you were thinking about working on a book. So if you wouldn't mind talking about what you're thinking about there.
Yeah, I'm. What I'd like to do is talk about my own experiences at Grace, and also the experience of many teachers with their students on some of the CRT, what we called programming, anti-racist and CRT
Mm.
programming. But what I think is missing is how it affects students and how it affects collegial relationships within educational institutions, and the way that it actually plays out in the context of a school. Um, I I've spoken to many students at Grace. I've spoken to many students at other schools, and I think what's interesting is there is a large number of students that are generally apathetic and kind of feel like, oh, why are the adults going crazy about all this stuff? There is another group which are true believers and are arguing with their parents every night about how we need to change this capitalistic system, and we need to address, and so then you have students that really do want to speak up but can't. And so I think that I saw such a wide range of reactions to this kind of education that we're seeing, and I want to make that real for people, um, that that maybe goes underneath a lot of the conceptual arguments, at the level of op-eds and Twitter. Like get into the heart of how it's affecting students, and then also I want to talk about in the book how the DEI industry functions. How do they gain entry into institutions? How do they convince the stakeholders? And then once they do, how do they push the curriculum into a school, and how do they get teachers on board? How do they run these trainings? What's it like to be in a training like this? And there are specific strategies now coming out with how some of the most successful DEI consultancies are reacting to the pushback. And I've gotten sent to me some seminars by these consultancies, and where they talk openly about controlling who do we let into the school, who do we let onto the board. I mean, they have an enormous sense of entitlement as to them making decisions for the decision makers. And in some cases, they'll give public speeches and statements connecting the parents who are concerned about CRT in schools with the January 6th rioters at the Capitol. So there's a real doubling down or even a tripling down going on right now. And I think it's just going to be, even though many people are just fed up with, like, do we need to keep talking about CRT? It's going to get worse. It's going to get more. It's going to be when the fall starts, and all the curriculum was set, back in April and March.
Mm.
So while this was starting, so all that's going to be rolled out, and the people who are pushing it are not able to compromise because of their own ideological commitments. They've sort of that's part of it, is that you don't compromise. Um, James Lindsay's talked about this. So the fact that I just see all of the forces aligning to even make this more explosive. So we will see.
Yeah, like when you mentioned the different kids, like who are some are disinterested, some are just kind of
Mm-hmm.
going along, whatever. Like, okay, when I first got back, the first thing I said was like, we've got secular blasphemy laws now. Like, what's going on? Like, it did have a faith-like feeling to it. And, John McWhorter's written quite a lot about it, and James Lindsay has as well. And I like, if you like, the way I look at it is, if you go through with this, CRT-based curriculum from K through 12. I mean, we shouldn't leave out the gender stuff because that's also in there
Mm-hmm.
as well. But I'm like, okay, these are now woke madrasas.
Mm-hmm.
And just like a madrasa in Pakistan, the kids who come out of the madrasas aren't all going to join the Taliban or aren't all going to join ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll have a significant portion of them that will think that, homosexuality is illegal and they should be put in jail. Like, apostates should be killed. Like, you still have kids who aren't going to go strap a suicide bomb on themselves, but they're going to support the people that do. And the ones that are opposed to it are just going to keep quiet because they don't want to be killed as an apostate or whatever. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like there was one kid, he was a university student in Pakistan. I think it was in 2016, 2015 or 16. His name was Mashal Khan. And he wasn't an apostate. He questioned a couple of things in the Quran. When I say question, he was asking questions about them because he was curious.
Mm-hmm.
The next day, students and faculty at the university beat him to death just for like
Mm-hmm.
asking some questions. So, I mean, that is going to shut anyone else up from asking questions, right?
Yeah.
So that's the way I look at it. And again, like, sorry, I'll ramble for a little. Like, I look at, when I started looking into this, like something like repressive tolerance, that started coming into, as far as I can tell, like in the mid 80s, it started coming into like colleges of like the ed colleges and stuff. And,
Mm-hmm.
I know Marcuse wrote that in 65 or whatever, um, but if you look at a lot of like kids, or if you look at the terms of service from any social media, it all talks about language that can do harm.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
it's all based on harm. So even though they might not agree with it 100%, okay, you got to censor everyone who's conservative, but that idea of harm is like in the air. It's taken in everywhere. So they also imbibe that a little bit. So when you have this kind of stuff going through the schools and you're indoctrinating kids from K through 12, by the time they get to university, it's, they've already drunk the Kool-Aid to some degree, and then it's easier to keep going. Like that's why I look at, when Jonathan Haidt talked about 2013 is kind of when they started leaving the universities. I'm like, okay, well in 2010 this was in some high schools. A kid going through high school in 2010 is getting to university 2014ish, right? So yeah, right around 2013 or just after is when you're going to see more of it leaving the university, because you've got more kids coming in already thinking in that manner. Like, so like that's like, for me, it's like, let's, if you want to give the two options, like if parents want to send their kids to one of these schools and you give them that choice, they go to one of these schools, whatever. Let's see which school does better. Let's see which school can actually produce, people who can do math, who can read, who can do whatever. Like, let's have that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up, K through, the, the madrasa analogy, because I've seen the curriculum at the kindergarten level, and from one of these consultancies, and it's the Pollyanna curriculum. And the way it works is, they know that the kids see things in moral primary colors, so they want to establish the palette early, of what is good and what is bad, and then once they get that basic moral instantiation, they can run all of the history and society on top of that, the way they understand those things. So, at the kindergarten level, there are 8 lessons plans totally devoted to color. So we're just going to see color. So it starts at a perceptual level, and then it slowly pushes the idea that this color, you pick your skin tone on the wall, and then you identify with that skin tone, and that gets tied to your racial uh, identity. And then, even in kindergarten, in the curriculum, teachers who feel confident can tie the color to the racial identity as early as kindergarten. And some of the scholarship, this is all based around the scholarship, maybe in quotes, because I haven't really seen the methodology, the data analysis, that kids see race as early as 6 months. So they have to try to acknowledge it and then combat it. But yeah, I'm not sure that those studies, when they justify this claim that kids see race as early as 6 months, this is not a extensive analysis of the literature. This is a cherry-picked study here and a cherry-picked study here and there. So that there is not, it's all scaffolded on what I think is pretty dubious work, even though I do want to read it all and digest it, but it's not, I don't think it's comprehensive in any way. So, that's how they're running the game, and that's how they're going to get them when they're young, and they are getting them right now when they're young. So I think that's where the parents of the youngest children really need to be vigilant, because they want to make a child's socially imposed identity the paramount way that they see themselves in the world. Once they identify as Black, Latino, Latinx, whatever, white, then they can make all the claims on top of that. But that has to be, and the question that I asked in the meeting in my school questioned the nature of identity itself, which is why I think they freaked out so hard, because I said, to what extent must I identify with how other people see me? Which I think is just I wanted to ask a question that to my mind cut to the quick of what was the central shaft of the ideology and the pedagogy, which was you are as others see you. You have a fanciful personality, which is your preferences and dreams and goals as an individual, but what really matters in the world is how other people see you, and you need to acknowledge and cleave to that in some way. So I wanted to, I believe in the individual. I believe that the celebration and the divinity of the individual is the greatest innovation in social relations that we've developed globally. So I'm not going to give that up, and I don't want kids to passively accept that this other way of seeing things without questioning it or feeling intimidated into to thinking it.
Yeah, there was a
So,
well, there's one example from Canada. It's not on the race thing again. It's on the gender thing where there's a kindergarten class, and I'd spoken to a civil rights lawyer who's actually helping the parents sue the school or the school board. Now the teacher put up a little spectrum on the wall, and like on one side you had fully female, on the other side you had fully male, and they were asking the kids, put yourself there. I guess they talked about, if you're a girl, you can like cars. If you're a boy, you can like dolls and whatever. Which fine, like that's normal, right? That's what it started doing that in the '80s. But this one little girl went up and she said, "I'm here," and pointed like fully female. And the teacher
mhm.
said, "There's no such thing. You're lying. No one can be fully female." Now, little kid went home. I mean, kindergarten,
Oh
what,
my
5 years
God.
old? And she was upset. She was crying, told her parents. Her parents freaked out. Like, like, you asked the kid to pick. The kid picked, and then
Yeah.
you berated her in class. I was just like, come on.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's the mask slipping. I mean,
Uh,
that shows you the agenda. It's not about freedom. It's about imposing this idea that gender is a spectrum, which is ludicrous. It's a massively bimodal distribution. It's the idea that you could just pick anywhere, and that I don't know. I find that stuff extremely agenda driven,
yeah, I
and
mean, again, it's
you know,
hypocritical because, like, like I said, in the '80s that started that, like, it doesn't matter if a girl plays with trucks or a boy plays with dolls. It's a boy that's playing with dolls or it's a girl that's playing with trucks. So, that's how you're a girl. That's how you're a boy.
right,
Now we're going.
right,
Now you're going back to those gendered stereotypes. Like,
right.
if you have long hair and you're a boy, then that must mean you're a girl. I mean, it's like, we're going
Yeah,
backwards and everything.
gender now. Exactly. Like I grew up in a progressive town, Ithaca, New York, and there the progress meant that gender didn't have to be a fixed archetype
Mhm.
of behaviors. You could be a girl and not shave your legs, or you could be a guy and you could play with dolls. Exactly. But now it's like gender categories are now seen as stereotypes, and if you deviate from them, well, then you either need to create your own gender or you need to go to the other gender. So categories are now stereotypes in and of themselves. I think that's really debilitating. And then people are body modding around, matching their idea of an archetype, which is not going to make them happy
No.
in the long run, because you're just going to be fine. You're just going to fall short of this new archetype. So you're going to need to either pick a new archetype as expression of yourself, or you need to change yourself to match the archetype that you're trying to get to.
Yeah,
So
no.
you're like just chasing a dragon. I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't want to get too far into the weeds of the gender
Yeah,
stuff because it's a whole other conversation because it's
yeah,
really
yeah.
screwed up. Look, I don't want to keep you too long. It's been really great to talk to you. If you have any advice for parents or you know or even students, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, my main. Everyone talks about the parents. I think parents are hugely important. I would just say, do your best to stay vigilant. Find
Mhm.
other parents that are like-minded, and you can collaborate and work together. And it's a lot easier to get things done if you can share resources and work together. Students, um, stand up for what your conscience wants to say. You have a right to question anything and everything that you get in class. You may lose friends. You may have, quote unquote friends, people that anytime you reveal, your inner nature to your peers, um, you're opening yourself up to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and reputation damage. But you'll make new friends. And actually, what I found is people respect you more when you stand up and stand out than if you cower and try to conform. So you'll be surprised. And I know it takes a lot for kids to do that, but I really think that's where the real growth happens.
No, well, that's great. Yeah, if you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Paul at Paul D Rossi.
Mhm.
D as in Damien, Paul D Rossi, or you can email me at teachingfortruth@gmail.com.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for coming on. It's good talking to you,
Thanks so much, Uwe.
and thanks everyone for listening.